The moment I arrived in the satellite truck, I saw them, the tornado siren wires, slashed and dangling like broken lifelines. My heart pounded as neighbors gathered, faces filled with fear and disbelief. Before I could speak, Sheriff Karen stepped forward, a cold smirk on her face backed by silent deputies. Tension crackled in the air. Then, out of nowhere, they tried to block me to stop the truth from getting out. And that is when I realized this was no accident. Karen had planned it all to silence me. Life in our neighborhood had always felt calm, almost unnervingly so. It was the kind of quiet that made you lean in and listen for even the faintest sound. I remember those early spring evenings vividly, families sitting out on their porches, the soft hum of cicadas mixing with the distant laughter of children playing. The air carried the scent of blooming jasmine and freshly cut grass. It was a simple peace, the kind you long for after the noise of the city. Time seemed to slow here, like the whole world was holding its breath. The tornado siren tower, old and rusty, stood tall at the edge of our street. To most people it was just a safety device. But for us, it was a symbol of protection, a lifeline we trusted without question. Every year, like clockwork, the community waited for the siren test, the loud, wailing sound that cut through the calm of the evening and reminded us that we were safe, prepared. That siren was more than a warning. It was reassurance, a promise that in the face of danger, help was near. It gave us a collective heartbeat. I had moved to this neighborhood not long ago, drawn by the quiet streets and the feeling of community I had never quite found before. At first, it felt like a dream come true. People knew each other by name, greeted you warmly, and watched out for one another. I enjoyed the slow pace and the familiar faces. But beneath that friendly surface, I began to notice something odd, a quiet tension, subtle but undeniable. The HOA was strict, yes, but it was more than just rules about lawn care and noise. It was a web of control, with Sheriff Karen at its center. Karen was not just the sheriff, she was the unofficial ruler of this place. Her presence was a shadow that stretched long and cold across our streets. The way she spoke, the way neighbors lowered their eyes when she passed, it was clear she demanded respect, whether earned or forced. At first, I told myself she was just doing her job. Small towns have their tough characters, and maybe she was one of them. But as days passed, I began to see how deeply she wielded her power, blurring the lines between law enforcement and HOA authority. I remember the first HOA meeting I attended. The room was filled with neighbors, but the air was thick with unease. Karen ran the meeting like a drill sergeant, her voice sharp and commanding. Complaints were silenced quickly, and any dissent was met with cold glares or pointed remarks. It became clear that in this neighborhood, obedience was not optional. It was demanded. The HOA's rules were enforced with an iron fist, and Karen was the hand that delivered the blows. Despite the underlying tension, the siren test remained a rare moment of unity and relief. It was almost sacred, a reminder that no matter what else was wrong, we still had that safety net. I looked forward to that sound, that brief interruption of silence that said, "We are ready." It was like a small celebration, a way to feel connected to something bigger than myself and my neighbors. For all its flaws, this place was home. The day before the siren test, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the rows of tidy houses. Kids ran through yards, chasing each other with carefree laughter, while older couples sat on benches, soaking in the quiet comfort. Mailboxes lined the streets, each one a little monument to the families that lived behind closed doors. It was beautiful and ordinary, the kind of scene that made you believe in safety and community. Yet beneath that calm, I sensed a storm gathering. The air felt heavy, charged with a tension I could not explain. Something was off, like the calm before a thunderstorm when everything holds its breath. I did not know it then, but that feeling was a warning. The peace I had taken for granted was fragile, and the person meant to protect it was about to shatter it all. The morning of the tornado siren test arrived like any other. I woke early, the sun barely peeking over the rooftops. The birds chirped as usual and the neighborhood slowly stirred to life. I stepped out onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, ready to hear that familiar wail. It was a sound that meant safety, order, and a shared understanding that this community looked after one another. I took a deep breath and waited. Minutes ticked by. The sun climbed higher, but the siren remained silent. I frowned, puzzled. I glanced around and saw other neighbors stepping outside, their faces puzzled too. Whispers floated through the air as groups gathered on sidewalks. Some looked up toward the tower, others exchanged uncertain glances. The silence was growing heavier by the minute. Curiosity and worry pushed me into action. I decided to check the siren tower myself. The walk was short, but my steps felt heavier with every inch. As I approached the metal frame, my eyes caught something strange, something that sent a cold chill through my body. The wires that powered the siren were cut, cleanly severed, as if someone had taken a sharp blade and sliced through them without hesitation. I stared at the dangling wires, heart pounding. This was not an accident. Someone had sabotaged our safety system. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was more than careless vandalism. It was deliberate, calculated. Our community's lifeline had been attacked. Fear and anger mixed inside me as I hurried back home. I knew there was only one person I could report this to, Sheriff Karen. Surely, she would understand the severity of what had happened. I imagined her rallying the deputies, organizing a quick fix. But as I approached her office, my hope faded. She was there, cool and composed, surrounded by her deputies. I explained what I had found, my voice steady but urgent. I expected concern, outrage, a plan of action. Instead, she gave me a cold, dismissive smile. "It is just a siren," she said, her eyes narrowing as if I was the one causing trouble. "You do not need to make this a big deal." Her tone was sharp, almost mocking. I blinked, stunned. "This is about safety. People rely on that siren." She shrugged. "Safety is not my problem. You should focus on your own yard." Her words hit me like a slap. The woman sworn to protect us was brushing off a clear threat to our community. I wanted to argue, to demand accountability, but something in her expression warned me to hold back. There was a dangerous coldness there, a hunger for control I had not seen before. That moment marked a turning point. I realized this was not some random act of vandalism or a mistake. Sheriff Karen had crossed a line. This was no accident, it was personal. She was sending a message, and I was at the center of it. I looked around the office. Her deputies stood silently, faces unreadable. No one spoke up. The silence was deafening. It was clear that Karen's power was absolute here, and anyone who challenged her would face consequences. Walking away, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The peaceful neighborhood I had admired was under siege, and the person supposed to protect it was the one doing the damage. But I could not let fear win. I had to find a way to fight back, no matter what it took. That morning, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I understood that our quiet community was about to become a battleground. After that morning, everything began to change. Sheriff Karen's grip on the neighborhood tightened like a noose, slowly closing around our throats. At first, it was subtle, a glare here, a whispered warning there, but it quickly escalated. Anyone who dared question her or voice concerns found themselves on the receiving end of her wrath. Complaints were quietly swept under the rug, and those brave enough to speak out were shamed or threatened. A heavy silence fell over the community, like a fog settling in, muffling voices and burying the truth. I felt the weight of that silence keenly. I saw neighbors who once smiled and greeted me now avoiding eye contact. The fear was real, not just of Karen, but of the deputies who stood loyally by her side. It was as if they were waiting for any excuse to strike back. The neighborhood that once felt like a refuge was becoming a place of quiet tension and mistrust. One afternoon, I gathered my courage and decided to confront Karen directly at the next HOA meeting. I walked into the room with my heart pounding but my voice steady. I demanded answers about the cut siren wires, the safety of our community, and the obvious sabotage that had been dismissed so casually. I expected pushback, but what I got was something far worse. Her deputies quickly surrounded me, forming a wall of cold, silent faces. Karen stood at the front, her smile thin and sharp, more like a knife than a friendly gesture. "You are making this personal," she said, voice low and dangerous, "and it will cost you." There was no room for debate, no chance for discussion. It was a clear threat, delivered with the cold precision of someone who believed herself untouchable. Behind the scenes, I began to uncover whispers of corruption that went deeper than I had imagined. Contracts for maintenance work were handed out to friends without bids. Fines were levied unfairly, targeting those who opposed Karen. Intimidation was the norm, used to silence dissent and protect those in power. The more I learned, the clearer it became that Karen was not just abusing her position. She was protecting a network of favoritism and control. I felt small, almost invisible, standing against such a well-oiled machine. Legal channels seemed clogged, officials uninterested or too scared to get involved. Every door I tried to open was met with a brick wall. Justice seemed like a distant, unreachable dream. But inside me, a flame was growing. I refused to let this go. The fear and frustration only hardened my resolve. I thought of my neighbors, the families who depended on that siren for their safety. I thought of the silence that had been forced upon us all, and I knew that if I stayed quiet, I was complicit. So I kept pushing, even when it felt like the world was closing in. I documented everything, every unfair fine, every threatening message, every suspicious decision. I reached out to anyone who would listen, even if that was just a few quiet voices in the dark. Karen's power was real and dangerous, but so was my determination. I was no longer just a resident, I was a fighter, and I would not stop until justice was served. I knew I could not fight this battle alone. Sheriff Karen's power was too vast, her network too deep. The walls she had built around herself were thick and impenetrable, but I was determined. If the community wanted justice, it was up to someone to light the spark. That someone was me. Quietly, I began reaching out to others. Neighbors I had once shared casual hellos with suddenly became allies in whispered phone calls and secret meetings. One by one, stories emerged, tales of unfair fines, of threats disguised as warnings, of safety concerns swept under the rug. It felt like pulling at a thread that unraveled a whole tangled web. We were not alone. The truth was bigger than I had thought. Our meetings were small, cautious affairs at first, a few trusted faces gathered in basements or behind closed doors. We shared what we knew, pooled what evidence we had. Photographs of the severed siren wires, copies of unfair fines, recordings of veiled threats. Every piece counted, every detail mattered. Together, we built a fragile but growing case. Technology became our secret weapon. A friend from the city lent me a satellite truck, a mobile broadcasting unit that could beam our message beyond Karen's reach. With it, we could bypass local news controlled by her influence and speak directly to the public. It was a risky move, but the only way to shine a light on the darkness she had created. As I prepared the satellite equipment in my garage, doubt gnawed at me. Could this ragtag group really stand up to the sheriff and her deputies? Would anyone listen? What if we made things worse for ourselves? Fear had kept us silent for too long, but now it pushed me forward. I made a promise to myself that night. If no one else would stop Karen, then I would, no matter the cost. The plan took shape slowly but surely. We would gather the community, expose the truth in a live broadcast, and demand accountability. It was more than a strategy, it was a call to action. I imagined faces watching, neighbors finally hearing the voices they had been too afraid to listen to. I pictured that moment when the tide might turn. Still, the stakes were high. I knew Corinne would fight back hard. The threats I had received before were only the beginning. I had already lost sleep over the weight of it all, but standing on the edge of this fight, I felt a strange mix of fear and hope. It was terrifying and empowering all at once. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit alone and think about what was to come. I remembered the Siren Tower, those dangling wires, a symbol of everything broken here. I thought of the neighbors who had stayed silent, trapped by fear, and I vowed that I would not let this community fall any further into silence and shadow. This was no longer just about me or Corinne. It was about the whole neighborhood, our safety, our dignity, and our future. With the satellite truck packed and my heart steeled, I was ready. The fight was coming, and I would face it head on. The day of the confrontation arrived with a weight that settled heavily on my chest. The neighborhood felt different. Tension hung in the air like a thick fog. I had spent hours preparing the satellite truck, making sure every piece of equipment was ready. This was my chance to break through the silence, to expose the truth in a way Corinne could no longer ignore. Minutes after the latest HOA meeting ended, I rolled the satellite truck down our quiet streets. The wires to the tornado siren still hung loose, an exposed wound for all to see. I parked near the Siren Tower, the very symbol of what had been broken for too long. Setting up the broadcast gear, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. This was not just a fight for me, it was for every neighbor who had suffered in silence. As the live feed went on air, I began to speak. I shared the story, the cut wires, the ignored safety risks, the threats, and the corruption lurking beneath the surface. I spoke honestly from the heart, hoping the truth would resonate. Faces appeared on the screen, neighbors gathering in driveways and on sidewalks, their expressions a mix of shock, disbelief, and hope. Then she appeared. Sheriff Karen arrived, her presence as cold and commanding as ever. She tried to talk over me, dismissing the claims as lies and exaggerations. But something was different this time. The deputies who usually stood by her unwaveringly shifted uneasily. Some looked away, others exchanged glances. The power she held seemed to flicker. "Enough," I said, voice firm. "You cannot hide any more." One by one, neighbors began to speak up, their voices breaking years of silence. They told their stories, unfair fines, threats, safety ignored. The crowd grew louder, stronger, united against the injustice that had ruled for too long. Corinne's grip was slipping as the truth spilled into the open like a flood. The tension in the air was electric. You could feel the walls Corinne had built around herself cracking. Her face tightened, and the veneer of control slipped, revealing frustration and fear. I looked around and saw the faces of those who had once been too scared to speak, now emboldened. For the first time, I saw hope. The neighborhood was waking up. The sheriff's power was no longer absolute. We were reclaiming our community one voice at a time. As the broadcast ended and the crowd began to disperse, I felt a surge of relief mixed with cautious optimism. The fight was far from over, but the tide had turned. This day marked the beginning of something new, a movement born from courage and the refusal to be silenced. That night, as I shut down the equipment and looked out over the quiet streets, I knew we had taken a vital step toward justice. Karen had been exposed. The community was no longer afraid, and I was ready for whatever came next. The moment the broadcast ended, I knew the fight was far from over. The truth had been laid bare, but Karen was not the kind to accept defeat quietly. The very next day, the backlash began. Threatening phone calls, cold stares from neighbors who suddenly seemed uncertain where their loyalties lay, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched shadowed every step I took. It was as if the walls themselves whispered warnings. Karen retaliated swiftly. Legal notices arrived in my mailbox, lawsuits threatening heavy fines and expensive court battles. She wielded the law like a weapon, trying to wear me down with paperwork and intimidation. The deputies, still loyal to her, stepped up their surveillance. I caught glimpses of them near my house, their eyes cold and calculating. Sleep became a stranger. Anxiety wrapped around me like a thick fog, suffocating and unrelenting. But amid the fear and uncertainty, something remarkable happened. Support surfaced from unexpected corners. Neighbors I had barely spoken to before brought food to my doorstep. Quiet words of encouragement replaced the silence. Small acts of kindness reminded me I was not alone. The community, though shaken, was beginning to rally behind the truth. One night after weeks of tension, I sat exhausted in my living room when my phone buzzed. A friend's message flashed on the screen. "You gave us hope." Those simple words struck a chord deep within me. All the stress, the threats, the sleepless nights, they suddenly felt worth it. I realized this battle was bigger than just me. It was about restoring faith in a community suffocated by fear. The emotional toll was immense. There were days when doubt crept in, whispering that this was too much to take on, that Karen's power was unbreakable. But every time I felt that way, I reminded myself why I started. I thought of the families counting on the Siren for safety. I thought of the neighbors who had been silenced for too long. Their courage fueled mine. Together, we began to heal. Not all wounds were visible, but slowly, trust started to rebuild. Conversations resumed. People looked each other in the eye again. There was a collective understanding that standing together was the only way forward. Karen's backlash only made us stronger. Her attempts to divide us failed. The more she pushed, the more united we became. The community was awakening from a long, fearful slumber. That chapter was painful but necessary. It tested our resolve and showed us what we were truly capable of. I knew the path ahead would be challenging, but I also knew that hope had been reignited. And with hope, anything was possible. Slowly but surely, the wheels of justice began to turn. The pressure we had built was no longer something Karen could ignore. The HOA board, once silent or complicit, faced recalls. Neighbors who had stayed quiet for so long found their voices and stepped forward. Investigations into Karen's conduct were launched, shaking the foundation of her control. The once untouchable sheriff was finally forced to answer for her actions. I remember the day they began repairing the siren wires. Seeing workers climb the rusty tower to reconnect those dangling cords felt like watching hope being restored. It was a simple act, but powerful, a symbol that safety and fairness were returning to our streets. The siren test sounded again, loud and clear, and for the first time in a long time, it brought a genuine smile to my face. Karen's status crumbled piece by piece. The power she had wielded with such cold certainty was slipping through her fingers. She was stripped of her authority, publicly reprimanded, and faced consequences that reverberated through the community. I watched as the woman who once ruled with an iron fist now struggled to maintain even a shred of respect. But this victory was not just about her fall. It was about the community rising together, reclaiming what had been lost. The bruises we bore were not just physical but emotional, wounds from years of fear and silence. Yet, despite the pain, there was pride. pride in standing up, in refusing to be broken. Neighbors came to me with thanks and hugs. They shared stories of their own small victories, fences rebuilt, fines dropped, relationships healed. I realized this was not just my win, it was ours. Together, we had faced down corruption and fear and won. Reflecting on it all, I felt a deep relief but also a quiet strength. The fight had changed me. It had taught me about courage, not the absence of fear but the will to act despite it. It showed me the power of community, of people united by a common cause. The road ahead was still long. Trust takes time to rebuild, and vigilance was necessary to ensure Karen's shadow never returned. But we were ready. We had learned our power. As I walked through the neighborhood that evening, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Children played without hesitation, neighbors talked openly, and the siren stood tall, a proud sentinel once again. This was a new chapter, one written by those who dared to stand up. And though the scars remained, they were a reminder of how far we had come. Justice had prevailed, and with it came hope, a hope that would carry us forward. Life returned slowly to a cautious normal. The streets once heavy with fear and tension began to breathe again. One of the first signs was the sound I had missed most, the tornado siren test. When it rang out loud and clear that morning, it felt like the heartbeat of the neighborhood had come back to life. It was more than just a safety signal. It was a message. We had survived the storm of corruption, and now we could rebuild. I spent many evenings walking through the neighborhood, watching neighbors reconnect. People who once avoided each other now exchanged smiles, shared stories, and worked together to heal the wounds left behind. The trust that had been fractured was slowly piecing itself back together. There were still scars, quiet reminders of the battle we had fought, but they were outweighed by the strength that grew from standing united. Reflecting on everything, I realized how much this fight had changed me. The fear, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, all had forged a resilience I had not known I possessed. More than that, it revealed something deeper about the power of community. We were no longer isolated individuals struggling in silence. We were a force, a network of people committed to protecting what mattered most. The friendships I had formed in those dark days were some of the strongest I had ever known. We had been tested by fire and emerged connected in a way that transcended simple neighborly ties. It was a bond born of shared struggle and hope. Though Karen was gone from our lives, the lessons she left behind lingered. We understood that vigilance was necessary. Power unchecked could always return if we allowed it. So, we committed to keeping watch, not just on the Siren Tower but on each other and the community's well-being. New initiatives took root. Neighborhood meetings became open forums, encouraging honest conversation and transparency. Safety programs were revived, this time with genuine involvement from residents. It was as if the neighborhood was waking from a long, uneasy sleep. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast golden light over the streets, I stood on my porch watching children play in the fading daylight. Laughter filled the air once more, light and carefree. I smiled, knowing this was just the beginning. The peace we had fought so hard for was fragile, but it was ours to protect. Together, we would remain vigilant, ready to stand against any threat that tried to take it away. Because we had learned something important. No matter how small a town, no matter how quiet the streets, the strength of a community lies in its people. And in that strength I found hope.